Right, here we go. Yes, my talk is Yeast, man's best friend. I consider yeast to be man's best friend and not the dog. Hopefully I'll explain why. So, why on earth would I be up here telling you all about yeast? Well, several years ago I did a PhD in yeast. That's me in a very fetching gown from the University of Manchester. Because yeast is a very, very important scientific research tool, but it's also used in all manner of practical applications such as beer and bread. So I'm going to be talking about the baker's yeast, which has got the Latin name Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Don't worry about that too much. You have dried yeast, which we're all familiar with on the left, and that's what yeast looks like under the microscope. Kind of boring, just big fat cells. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is a microorganism. It is a fungus. It's in the same family as mushrooms, and it's a budding yeast. It divides by budding. You can see that occurring on the right. Now, one thing it's not is bacteria. A lot of people think that because it's a microorganism, it must be bacteria. No, bacteria is very, very different. Yeast is eukaryotic. It has lots of lovely organelles in it, so it's all quite complicated, quite compartmentalised. And this is important because pretty much everything that isn't a bacteria on the planet is a eukaryotic organism. So plants, fruit flies, us, and even a load of cute puppies. They are all eukaryotes. So we study yeast to look at really basic biology, things like growth and cell division and genetics. And there's one thing that I find absolutely fascinating, is that yeast has about 6,000 genes and humans have about 25,000. So essentially, if you take the genetic material in yeast and multiply it by 4, you end up with enough for a human. And I think that's absolutely amazing. Research-wise, it's also incredibly useful because you can freeze it at -80 Celsius and keep it forever, essentially. And all deletion mutants are available, so if you're just studying any gene, you can just call up someone and say, I'd like a yeast strain without this gene, please, and they'll just mail it off to you. It's brilliant. So it's a really useful model organism, which we've learned a hell of a lot from. So now I'm going to move on to practical applications. And the first one is bread making. Now, this has to be the most annoying thing for a yeast researcher to hear. Whenever you read the recipe telling you to dissolve the yeast, you don't dissolve yeast, it's a living thing. So what does it do? Well, it leavens the bread. Very straightforward process. You've got your yeast in your bread, and it converts some of the carbohydrates and oxygen into CO2, and the gas comes up, and you end up with lovely leavened bread. It's a process called respiration. In humans, when you have carbohydrates and oxygen, that makes CO2, and we're very happy with ridiculously photogenic as well. But if we don't have any oxygen, then we end up making lactic acid, and that hurts. Now, yeast, when it's got oxygen, also makes CO2, but when it doesn't, instead of producing lactic acid, it produces alcohol. And that, of course, means one thing. It means booze. For example, beer. It's made in a process called fermentation. Beer is pretty straightforward. It's just malt, water, hops, and yeast. You get some aerobic respiration as well, therefore you get the bubbles as well as the alcohol. And when you've made beer, you can make yeast extracts. You can take the leftover yeast and put it through all sorts of various horrible treatments, and you end up with Marmite, which is delicious, I believe. It's also used to make wine, and there's very little to wine, to be honest. Wine is just fermented grape juice. You can make it in enormous fats, just like that. Not a huge amount to say about wine, really. And however, with champagne has a secondary fermentation, so you have to be doubly thankful to yeast for champagne. You have the yeast in the bottle, and that produces the carbon dioxide, which makes champagne fizzy. You can also make whisky. You essentially start by making beer, and you then distill what comes out, and that distillation process gives you some very, very concentrated alcohol. So I say cheers. Let's hear it for yeast, man's best friend.